We can see the screen but cannot hear.
Part of life is central now to our perception tasks. How do we perceive 3D from just a single RGB image? So this is very ill-defined because we have only the single view of the RGB colors. And we see a proton, you can possibly recognize many of the objects here despite being only one view, despite having many inclusions. And so we need to understand these strong 3D colors in order to understand the structure of the objects in the environment. So we can look at very strong 3D colors, for instance, data shapes like StruCo3D, Parametric, and retrieve and align them to the image. And thus to understand how the objects in the image are structured. So we can do this by basically looking on 2D segmentation methods, which we further now quite powerful, and to extract out the detected objects in the 2D image, embed them into a joint embedding space with 3D models. Here, there's a bit of a domain gap there, so we're actually looking for within this embedding space that the RGB observations and the 3D shapes are placed together if they're structurally similar to each other. Regardless of them coming from rather different kind of domains, and then you can work out the translation to the objects actually we're seeing in the image themselves. So we have some standards embedding space with feedback learning, in particular with the use of compact blocks. And that results in an embedding space with the rules of this with the TSM visualization. So if we do end up with clusters, for instance, in the top left, we have sort of round tables, and then bottom we have a picture that are clustered together by structural similarities rather than by appearance features. So that allows us to retrieve by querying a new RGB observation into the embedding space and pulling out the nearest neighbor shape that represents the object. And so here we have this property of being able to understand the structure of 3D objects up to the validity of the data set. So all of these objects are going to be physically plausible and valid when retrieved and aligned to the image observation. Of course, this can be extended even further for more challenging environments. So here, actually, this kind of image from stagnant is a bit more like ones that you might see in the wild, rather than ones found in my catalog. And so you have a bunch of exclusions and for visibility of many of the objects in the environment. So if we do a path-based training, we can still end up with a reasonably robust representation of the objects in the environment. On the other hand, there are certain limitations, right? If you are retrieving things from a database, it's fixed database. So it's pretty much guaranteed to not have the actual object that you're observing in the database itself. So you're just looking for nearest potential candidates. So in the image, of course, we see and what's being pretty kind of nicely represents similar kind of structures, but it's obviously not that clear and also not the same here in the environment. But with me relaxing at the hard constraints of using a fixed database as this required, and learn something a bit more flexible. And so that goes to learning these manifolds that represent valid shapes and parts. You've seen some of them already in the early talks today that produce really nice kind of decodings of shape spaces, and in particular one and two from the manifold that decode out to these shapes and parts. We wanted to be able to leverage it to optimize actually fit to an input observation. And so from an input, we want to bring that into that manifold and see what is the best that represents what we see here. So that allows for a bit more flexibility than the fixed database with pre-compiled approach. So in particular, the task we're looking at here with some of this input or the construction on the right-hand side, we want to be able to recognize the objects and their complete type of composition, so including various arrangements and regions in this environment. So what we do is from this RGB scan at a high level, we're first trying to map into our line manifold of shapes and parts. And so that produces some initial answers for all of the objects here in the environment. If we get better than that, we can then optimize such that it actually fits the geometric observation that we have in the RGB scan on the scan optimization. And we can leverage the fact that we know that we come all of this in the scene and try to optimize for some consistency. And so that allows us to figure out the shapes from our amendments that now represent the input observation. So the way that we learn this shapes is pretty simple. So we have coordinate for MRP, where is the XYZ coordinate in the twins, and all has the parts, so we have the parts including the part count, as well as
into the MLP to predict the accuracy of the part at that particular location, as visualized here for these separate parts of the chair. And so this can be optimized in an autodecoder fashion in order to learn the MLP as well as part latents that correspond to all of the train instances. So here you see FP is the MLP function. It produces a distance value that we can simply compare it to the ground truth SDF values in order to optimize this function, in addition to a regularization on the latent codes to ensure that we have a relatively compact manifold. And in fact, we can do pretty much the same thing for the shapes, since we have no part types. It's just a shape latent and the coordinate that are being input into the MLP to predict the SDF. Again, this is being trained in the same fashion, so that we have latent codes for all the train shapes here. So if we walk through the space that we've just optimized, you can see some of the different interpolations through the part spaces for these different class categories. So here we're moving from just two different types of objects in all of these classes. In fact, we can even smoothly interpolate through a different discrete number of legs, for better or for worse, considering that the intermediate states are not necessarily going to be fully valid shapes in that scenario, but it allows for the flexibility for us to potentially walk through the manifold and find something that better fits the input observation, right? So from an input scan, then we're first going to take all of the detected objects from a state-of-the-art 3D box detector. Use that geometry features in order to predict the set of part types that exist. For instance, here for the chair, the seat, the back, and the legs. And we want to map them now into the latent manifolds. So in particular, this mapping is being trained on just the optimized set of latent codes from all of the train instances, which means that actually, despite being a regression task, it actually operates very similar to retrieval. It's going to put out a code that's very similar to the nearest train shape in the training set. So what you get out looks like a nice kind of shape of a chair here, but it doesn't fit precisely to the input observation. And so now we want to be able to improve that shape code by optimizing the manifold. And so just to help guide the optimization, we also have a coarse estimate of against segmentation so that we can constrain the parts to match the input geometry. We also have a regularization constraint that the part and the shape decoding, this is why we predict both parts and shape, are matching to each other, because we want to encourage nice properties like symmetry in the output decoded shape, as well as discourage divergence of parts from each other as they're being optimized. And finally, I think it's kind of nice because we often have repeated instances of the same kind of objects in one scene. We can take advantage of that information that this comes from just one scene environment. And if there are any objects that had decoded out to something similar in the shape latent space, we can constrain them to optimize to a consistent shape decoding here. And so that allows for a much nicer fit to the input observations, as well as more consistent representations of all of these objects, despite the fact that they've been seen from many different kinds of views, and they have different kinds of occlusion patterns. So just to visualize that optimization process, you can see as it's iterating through and trying to fit better to the input scene constraints here. So I think that's kind of nice. We can leverage these learned part spaces and then fit them directly, right, to the input environments. And in contrast to prior state of the art that takes like a single forward pass prediction, that means that we can actually have more accurate shape part completions in these RGBD scans. So perhaps more easily visualized in a qualitative fashion. So you can see in comparison to prior part-based state of the art, we can achieve a better fit to the input geometric constraints of the scene. So here again, and also in comparison to without this scene consistency constraint, this actually helps to get just more information out of all of the objects in the environment to achieve a better representation. So we get a bunch of nice kind of part decompositions now on these real world environments. But can we actually take the same kind of approach and apply it, maybe not just for objects and parts, but complete, object configurations in 3D scenes. And in particular, since we don't, want to rely heavily on limited quantities of 3D data, can we actually learn these kinds of scene priors or parametric scene models without full 3D supervision? All right, so instead we're going to relax the 3D supervision constraint a little bit and say, maybe we can learn from 2D multi-view data instead. So here, basically, assuming that we would have multiple image observations of the same environment rather than the full 3D reconstruction, and maybe we can leverage the semantic information that is now relatively easily extractable from this kind of information. And so we want to learn the same kind of nice manifold here, now representing 3D scenes and their object configurations, so that we can decode them out to valid scenes. So here you can see a visualization of what we would like, right, to be able to sample multiple codes and produce different kinds of nice valid 3D scene configurations. In fact, potentially interpolate through these codes. Philosophically, this is an interesting kind of question, whether you want this space to be completely continuous, since in fact you would have to appear and disappear objects when we have a different number of objects in the environment, or potentially that objects of different class categories. So you can judge for yourself whether the approach that we've taken matches up with your expectations. And finally, if we learn a nice manifold of these 3D scene environments, then we can use it for conditional generative tasks, for instance, to try to match to an input image and decode out the representative scene in the latent space here that produces a similar manifestation of that image. So in particular, the approach we're going to take is to try to model a decoder that can take in an input latent code, produce a 3D scene, and that scene should be constrained by how well it matches to the semantic information in these 2D images. So in particular, we're operating based on semantic constraints because these ones are relatively robust towards domain differences. Since here we're modeling just object geometries, and in the 2D images, they have a huge variation of color and texture, whereas semantic boxes, semantic masks, should have a very similar kind of distribution across these two domains. So our model is based on a transformer. We first sample a vector from a hypersphere, and we're going to start to generate the scene in an autoregressive fashion. So at the beginning, we have just an empty room. So that's the start token. And the scene context is being learned from whatever we have at the moment, just an empty room. And then we try to decode out the next object in the environment. So since we're operating autoregressively, once we predict the next object, that becomes an input to the scene context, and we can predict the next following object afterwards. So finally, we have n objects in the scene, and we want to be able to produce an actual scene from the set of features. So we are modeling the scene as sort of the layout and the individual object shapes. So in particular, all of these object feature vectors, they're being decoded by MLPs to predict the class category of the object, the bounding box of the object, that these two effectively represent the layout of all of the objects in the scene, as well as the geometric structure of the shape as a deformation on a template sphere mesh. And for representing then the detailed sort of structure of all of the objects in the environment. So here we start training, and you can see the initial scene being represented by all of the default sphere meshes for the objects. And we start to optimize first for the general structure or the layout of that scene environment, which means we're only optimizing for the object class categories and their bounding boxes. And these, when rendered out, should match with the distribution of the 2D semantic box detections. So here, this will move all of the objects into a general kind of structure in the scene. And that will produce some kind of layout that's approximately matching now with our multi-view information from just 2D boxes. And so once we have the layout that has reasonably converged, we can start to refine the actual shapes of the objects as the deformations on the spheres. And of course, these should match with the masks in the 2D images. So that gets the general kind of structure of the scenes here. We can even go a bit further, since this is just sphere deformations. If you want to produce a bit of a nicer 3D scene, we can use the estimated geometry of the objects to retrieve back into a CAD database so that we have a nice CAD representation of the environment. So once this is trained, we can then start to sample 3D scenes from the space. And so these are just a bunch of arbitrary sampled codes in the optimized space. Again, these represented by the retrieved CAD models to the layouts and the shapes that are being produced by the latent code. Here is kind of interesting. We can also interpolate between two samples here from the top left down to the bottom right. And you can see this is a kind of interesting task because we don't have the same number of objects actually in the two samples. So some of them are basically appearing and disappearing as we move forward. And eventually we come to something that's a bit closer to the second sample here. So since our scene generation also encodes basically whether or not these objects are existing, we are able to just suddenly appear or disappear at some point in the interpolation process, the objects. And finally, we can also use the manifold in order to try to look up scenes that represent input images, in particular, again, based off of the 2D boxes and semantic masks that are in the images. We try to find a latent code of the scene that best fits with the 2D semantics that are being observed in that image. So that's kind of cool that we can then reconstruct an estimate of the object structure in this environment. So again, it's not going to be fully perfect. Here you see, for instance, the mask of the TV in the top example was relatively small, and we end up with the wrong orientation of that TV in the scene reconstruction. But we do have approximately all of these objects here. And similarly for some of the chairs, because the masks are a bit small in this image due to the occlusion with the tables, you do end up with slightly wrong orientations of the chairs actually in the reconstruction. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about in depth about potential outlooks in this kind of direction. So of course, interesting aspects of what we were talking about fitting to image and video inputs. I think there's a lot more opportunities here because we're only modeling really the structure and geometry, and actually appearance modeling materials and so on are very important to understanding actually the structure of 3D shapes and also of 3D scenes. And as well as better ways to sort of implicitly learn properties like symmetry or volume constraints that we would like to have to maintain the physical validity once we remove some of these hard constraints like, pure retrieval from a database. We still want to be able to move around the latent manifolds, but we want to preserve some physical plausibility, perhaps without fully modeling the whole physics simulation. Of course, recently we've seen huge advances in language models, and I think there's an interesting opportunity here, not just for editing, but I think because in 3D we have, somewhat limited data. And so language kind of lies at completely the opposite spectrum. We have tons and tons of text and language data, and that might be something that can help to ground the learning of 3D-based features. So that we can leverage more rich kind of encodings and the massive quantities of data. I mean, we also want to be able to take advantage of 3D data that does exist without labels. And for instance, here, we've actually developed an approach to do unsupervised 3D understanding. So without any manual annotations, we can actually start to get the general structures of these big furniture kind of like objects in the environment. On the other hand, I do think there's actually a bit of a hole missing in our understanding as we're moving from shapes to 3D scenes, that going fully unsupervised is, I think it is cool and important, but we're still actually missing examples of high fidelity 3D content to learn the general structures for. So this is also what we're looking at in terms of trying to address the gap for high fidelity 3D information. And in this case, you see the scan from the ScanNet data set, which has clear artifacts in terms of the geometry in the environment, whereas what we're doing now is trying to collect a much higher quality version, ScanNet++, that actually maintains the geometric fidelity that's high enough to represent really the highest fidelity kind of 3D scene data that we could potentially learn from. And just having some examples, I think, of real world environments at this kind of high quality in combination then with all of the more weak signal that you can potentially get from large masses of text and images will help to produce the next generation of methods that can really understand the structure of objects and their geometry. So here we're actually collecting both high-end geometry as well as much higher quality color, so that we can understand all of the properties of the objects in the environment. In particular, what this is basically being collected with paired high-end geometry and color, as well as more commodity sensor in terms of an iPhone. So this is from the geometry standpoint, collected with a bar laser scanner that's got about 1 millimeter resolution in geometry, high-end color from a DSLR, and an RGB stream to represent the commodity information from an iPhone 13. And we've got, we're looking at understanding, the same kind of semantic object structures in these environments. So we have annotations in terms of the objects and their instances that can now be resolved due to the high resolution of the geometry in this environment. So I think this is something that can potentially help to produce signal for new methods that look at really comprehensive understanding of 3D structures here. All right, so currently this is an active effort in terms of collecting this kind of data. So we do have at the moment around 400 scenes, almost 200K DSLR frames, a few million iPhone RGB frames, and a bunch of already annotated class labels and instances. And we're hoping to basically have this as the representative of high fidelity data so that you guys can help to develop the next generation of methods that understand structure of objects in environments. All right, so with that, I would like to conclude. Thanks for your attention, and thanks also to the students and collaborators who really helped make all of this work happen.
We have time for 2 questions.
Angie, I'm gonna ask, so the motivation for the neural parts priors work, as I understand it, was basically like, well, we can retrieve these 3D shapes, but they're never going to be perfect matches. So we should learn this neural implicit parametric prior so we can really get sort of much better matches to what's in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've always loved about these retrieval-based systems is that you can retrieve super high quality geometry so that you can get production quality assets out of them. And when you've gone to this sort of neural implicit model, now you don't have that property anymore. And I know that, like, for example, Mika, who spoke earlier, had this paper on like joint learning to retrieve and deform 3D shapes to match images. So I'm curious to hear where your head's at in that space, about what you think is most important. Do you think there are ways to, bring these approaches together? Just, what you're thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I in general, I actually like that kind of approach that maintains the high fidelity of the shapes that are being retrieved. It ties a little bit in the context of what I think, and I might be wrong, that it's a bit challenging to learn 3D when your sort of examples of high fidelity data are not that high fidelity in the first place. So when you're learning from ShapeNet meshes and you want to retrieve them, they look great as they are retrieved. But once you want to start to deform them, they become more challenging because these are not really artist quality level of meshes. And so that's part of the reason why then we went straight to a fully, implicit representation, because we have a lot more flexibility in the shape manifold, and it does operate nicely in a continuous fashion, whether or not that's kind of the right approach or not. And so that gave us kind of, I think, at the moment, the better trade-off between flexibility and the ability to represent the geometry there without having to deal with the strange sort of internal representation of many of these objects that actually do exist in data sets that are collected just off the web like ShapeNet. So we're trying to go the other route of trying to get like real world kind of high fidelity data rather than, the artist modeling kind of version, which I think is also pretty cool, but I don't have the right solution to that one at the moment. Yeah, learning about how to generate artist quality meshes without really having a lot of access to them is another kind of interesting challenge there too.
Yes, one more question.
Thanks for this very nice talk. Okay, so I just want to ask, your final result, the final few slides that you show the reconstruction of the TV, but somehow the TV is floating in the air. So I'm just wondering, how do you deal with this kind of occlusion or object attached to another object kind of problem?
So I guess you mean in terms of learning the 3D scene priors, and we don't have any explicit constraints at the moment for sort of the physical plausibility of the environments, right? So we're learning these mostly that they just match sort of the rendered